Policy and Corporate Affairs at BBC Scotland. We might hear about Ian's job a bit this afternoon, but it involves daily liaison with a range of corporate stakeholders, including the UK and Scottish governments and parliaments, as well as the worlds of academia, industry and business. A member of BBC Scotland's Executive Board, Ian acts as a spokesperson for the organisation in public fora, I guess this is one of those, and currently is coordinating the Charter Engagement Strategy. Ian's also responsible for coordinating the work of BBC Scotland's various advisory committees and oversees the organisation's accountability functions, including those relating to freedom of information, data protection and escalated complaints, which sounds very serious.
I'll talk about those in a minute or two.
Maybe we'll have some anecdotes. Ian started his career in teaching and lecturing before moving to Strathclyde Regional Council in 1988 and joining BBC Scotland's press office in 1995. Work in PR, marketing and international relations in the Middle East followed before Ian returned to BBC Scotland in 2000 to work on BBC Scotland's Pacific Key project, which we'll remember was, I guess, in emergence at that point.
It was, yeah.
From 2000 to 2006, Ian oversaw the organisation's governance and accountability functions as Secretary to the BBC in Scotland and to the Broadcasting Council for Scotland. Ian's Honorary Professor in the School of Culture and Creative Arts and is connected with Philip's Centre for Cultural Policy Research at the University of Glasgow, and also sits on the board of the University of Edinburgh's Al Walid Centre. So it's really wonderful to have Ian here today, because as I'm sure many of you will know, the Royal Charter, which is the constitutional basis for the BBC, which sets out its public purposes and guarantees its independence from government, runs only up to the 31st of December 2016, after which a new charter comes into force. And Philip's alluded to the white paper that was issued in May of this year by the Culture Secretary. So I think Ian's talk and presence here is particularly timely, and I'm hoping that Ian might provide us with a review of the white paper and the likely threats as well as opportunities that might emerge in the future, both for the BBC generally, but for BBC Scotland in particular. On a more personal note, I'd also like to say that the Scottish Graduate School is extremely grateful to you, Ian, for stepping in at relatively short notice, because it was meant to be a double act between Angela McRobbie and Philip Schlesinger, but unfortunately Angela McRobbie had to withdraw, and she sends her profound apologies for that. So Ian, thank you so much for stepping in to the breach that was left there. The Scottish Graduate School's relationship with the BBC is, I think, going from strength to strength. From the very successful internship offered by the BBC earlier this year to the really rich workshop on broadcasting that's taking place full day on Wednesday, and the lineup for that Tuesday. Thank you for correcting me. Don't turn up on Wednesday, it's tomorrow. And the lineup's amazing for that, so it's great to see other folk from the BBC coming into our offer in a way. And it does feel like we're building a partnership of some sort now with the BBC, and I hope it's a mutually beneficial one, although I think it might be a bit skewed to our benefit at the moment, given Ian's presence here and the workshop there tomorrow. And I'm alert really to the fact that Ian is the person in the BBC who's making that relationship with us possible. So an extended thank you for your efforts on our behalf, Ian. Big warm welcome.
Thank you, Dee, for that. I'm not quite sure how I can actually follow that. I feel like just sitting down, that seems to be as good as it's going to get. Thank you also to Jude for inviting me along today. What I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about an insider's view of working in a creative industry, in my case, broadcasting. As Dee said, I've been there more or less for the best part of 20 years. And in that process, I've actually seen 3 charters, 96, 2006, and the one that we're currently undergoing at present. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And at the end, I'll talk a bit about the white paper, what that charter is actually meaning. What does it mean for us? What does it mean for you, as much as anything? But to start off, I thought I'd talk a little bit about what it's like to work in the industry. And I think, first of all, I think probably that I should deliver the good news. Is that the good news is basically, if you do find yourself working in that industry, it's long hours. It's often very antisocial hours. It's sometimes horribly frustrating. It's stressful. It involves working to the tightest of deadlines. Competition for jobs is horrible, but it's there. And if you're working for the BBC, very often you find yourself as much on the receiving end of criticism as you do of praise. And believe me, there are an awful lot of people out there who are really, really waiting to criticise the BBC. It may be because they have a commercial axe to grind, it may be because there's a particular political agenda they want to pursue, but effectively it comes with the territory. So that's the good news. There's better news to come. However, I'll try not to be ironic. The better news effectively is it is an incredible organisation. It's an incredible industry to work in. Whether you're working in front of a camera, in front of a microphone, or behind the microphone and camera, whether you're working in an edit suite, whether you're undertaking the research that makes sure that every programme gets to air and every programme is fully informed, or if you're doing something like me, dealing with stakeholders on a regular basis. And thankfully, not all stakeholders are people standing outside the front door brandishing stakes. Sometimes they actually are. They actually quite like you. But effectively, all of those roles are important in getting that product to air. And I was thinking, when I was putting this together, I was thinking about, well, what are the qualities required of those who actually basically work in broadcasting and certainly work for the BBC? And I think the first one that struck me is passion. It's the one thing that identifies virtually every single person you speak to as working in broadcasting. And I was reminded of that story, probably apocryphal, of John F. Kennedy, who made an unannounced visit to the Cape Canaveral space facility in Florida in the early 1960s. And as he was going around interviewing people, just talking to them, he happened upon somebody wearing a brown coat, an overall, and said to him, "What do you do?" And he said, "Well, I'm helping to put a man on the moon, sir." Now, in actual fact, he was a cleaner, but it didn't matter. Irrespective of what role he held in that particular occupation, in that particular enterprise, he felt part of that. And I think that's the same for broadcasting. You don't necessarily have to be in front of a camera to be an integral part of the broadcast enterprise. What I'd say for the BBC is our aspirations effectively are not quite as high as interplanetary travel, so effectively Cape Canaveral may apply as a maxim there. But I think that basically, as I said, irrespective of what you are doing in the organisation, it is part and parcel of everybody's job to make sure that the highest quality of programme is brought to air and that the absolute rigour is actually applied in the construction of that programme, from taking it from a basic idea through to a commission, through to effectively a broadcast piece. Now, that takes a range of qualities. It takes ability, it takes flair, it takes expert knowledge, it takes thorough research and meticulous attention to detail. And of course, as I said, it takes passion and it takes a belief in the value of broadcasting. Now, okay, that may to you sound like PR speak, along the lines of, well, he would say that anyway, wouldn't he? Now, that may well be true, but it doesn't necessarily in any sense undermine the validity of the argument. That I think it is absolutely these are defining factors of those, defining features of those who work in the industry. Now, if you were to talk to any of our programme makers, I'm coming from a particular perspective, and I'll talk about that in a minute or two, but if you're to talk to our programme makers, they might come at it from a different direction. They might talk to you more about the difficulties of actually taking an idea from a very basic idea or a basic notion all the way through to a finished product. There's a remarkable journey has to be undertaken from saying, why don't we do a history of Scotland, to eventually ending up with a 5-part series on television, a 10-part series on radio, a series of whatever else goes with it. It could be online pages, it could be concerts by the Scottish Symphony Orchestra, BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra, it could be blogs, it could be material gained through an app, whatever. Taking it from one place to another is a very, very, very lengthy process, but one where you have to apply rigour in the research all the way through. It's about telling a new story or telling an old story in a new way. And I'll come on to that in a second or two. I'm just aware that I'm doing this with these in my hand. I'm expecting a snowstorm of white paper at any second, so I'm grasping these for dear life as I'm doing this. I guess the other point I would make about that is that if you were to talk to those programme makers, the one thing that they would tell you is that yes, there is enormous frustration in getting all that process through, talking to commissioners, juggling budgets, trying to work out shooting schedules, working against the most impossible of deadlines. But at the same time, they'll tell you there's tremendous relief and indeed pride in getting that product to air and actually seeing the fruit of that labour. And what they would then tell you is the next day it's back to the drawing board and it starts all again. You are only ever as good as your last story. In the same, using that maxim of Ted Turner in the early days of CNN, as soon as you've finished that piece and it's on air, end of story, you're back again at the starting point, as it were. Dee mentioned the introduction to broadcasting session that's taking place tomorrow. That's exactly what we hope to do in the space of about 7 or 8 hours, is actually take those who've signed up for it, give them a quick immersion into what broadcasting means in Scotland, how it works, wander around the building, but then to take them through that from a very basic idea through to a commission, through to an actual pitch to commissioners, a pitch and then to the commissioners, and then basically what happens next, all the way through the shooting schedule, into the edit, and then basically a final product, as it were. Now, we'll be using examples tomorrow. If anybody thinks we're going to produce a programme in the space of about 4 hours, I'd have to sadly disabuse you of that notion. But in true Blue Peter fashion, we'll be bringing one that we made earlier along to so you'll get an idea basically of what it's around. What I'd like to do is today is to give you a slightly different perspective on broadcasting. Maybe not that which an actual programme maker would bring, but somebody who spends their life working behind the scenes, but working in conjunction with the creative thinkers, with those producers, working with those who are involved in that very product and that very production. One of the things that comes to I often think about basically is the role of the BBC, and it's often said that the BBC is one of this country's most valuable cultural assets. It is often rightly so praised for the content that it produces, but at the same time, the other side of that coin is it can very often, as I said, find itself on the end of some very barbed criticism. And I think, as I say, that very much comes with the territory. And some say that we don't necessarily deal as well with that criticism as we might. Why don't we just stand up against the naysayers? Why don't we bang the desk and say, basically, we're the BBC, you've got it wrong, we've got it right? I think there probably was a time when the BBC did have that kind of mindset, that effectively it was there broadcasting to the nation, and the audience were there simply to receive its combined wisdom on a nightly basis on BBC One or Radio 4. I think that kind of thinking has long gone. And I think there is much more of a mindset within the BBC whereby we will contest those who complain about the BBC if we believe there is validity in so doing. We will pick our fights. We will choose the battles that we choose to fight. I think the one thing we have to remember is that the BBC is a different kind of organisation. That's quite an important point to remember when I come back to talk about the Charter. It's not like other institutions. It's publicly funded for a start-off, but it's not an arm of the state. It's not a quango. It's independent. And impartiality is a byword in the way that it approaches its reporting of issues. I think these are all important qualities, basically, because that impartiality, that independence, to me, seems to be the currency on which the relationship between the audience and the BBC is founded. That effectively the audience expects the BBC to be a trusted, honest, impartial, independent voice. Now, that doesn't leave us in a terribly comfortable position at times. And it was interesting, I've just been recently reading Charlotte Higgins' book. She's a Guardian columnist, Guardian journalist. And she conducted a whole series of interviews around the BBC recently, which were published in The Guardian and then collated in the book A New Noise. And it was interesting that she was talking about the government's role relative to the BBC in setting the charter and in setting the licence fee. And what she described it as basically was that relationship between the two as a curious dance. And I thought rather well characterised it as a delicate waltz that might slide into a sparring match, a grapple, or occasionally a death grip. Well, I think grapple on a regular basis with government, we certainly do. Although I'm glad to be able to report that no contretemps has yet resulted in our untimely demise in any way. But even when the relationships between the government and the BBC are at a low, there is still an underlying belief in the value of public service broadcasting and an underlying belief in what the BBC can and should do. And it comes back to the point that Philip was making a bit earlier about public value, about actually being paid for by the public purse and offering something back. And I'll come back to that as we go through this discussion and perhaps in the questions later. I believe that the BBC, I'll tell you one thing, I think we're terrible at one thing, really, really bad, and that's telling people what we do. I have never taken a group around Pacific here, headquarters just down in the Clyde, and I take many, many groups around, corporate groups, broadcasters, whatever. I have never yet taken one group around where by the end of it, somebody hasn't said to me, I didn't know you did that. And very often, it's not just what we do on screen, it's the other things that we do. Very few people would recognise that in the last 10 years, the BBC's put something like £50 million into charities in Scotland through Children in Need and through the work of the charitable arm of the BBC. Very few people could tell you exactly what the Scottish Symphony Orchestra does beyond concerts in the City Hall in Perth, Aberdeen and so on. It can't really talk about all of the educational work, the outreach work it does with schools and community groups and others. It's all of that added value that the BBC brings, the apprenticeships that are regularly offered, the hundreds of school children who come in on work experience placements, the mentoring that's undertaken. And getting back to some of the points that were being raised about that very good point you raised about how do you know who you are. One of the things we do is we regularly encourage our staff to go out and join other organisations, to work in charities, to offer their services, to actually give pro bono work as part of what they are and what the BBC does. Now, a lot of that is lost in the mix. It's not part of the conversation. And I think it's an important part of what does differentiate the BBC from other broadcasters. One thing that concerns me as well is and I've been thinking certainly of the events of the last week as well, is that the more and more that we are increasingly informed by likes and shares, but the more that the echo chamber of social media draws views in basically and amplifies those voices, and the more it tends to exclude alternative viewpoints, the more those audiences become very much niche audiences based around a particular perspective or particular views. That to me offers the rationale as to why the BBC is absolutely required. In a society where that's happening, you need something that stands beyond that. It may interact with social media. I think it's important that it does, and it uses social media accordingly. But that said, it has to stand back, and it gets to something, we may talk about this later. There is an interesting place for the BBC to be in right now relative to its editorial guidelines, which determine everything that we do and say on television, on radio. It determines basically the conduct of our journalists and how they go about their business and what we actually deliver. Social media has a different set of principles which guide it. So the question here is basically, how does the BBC keep pace with the change in technology, the change in the way that people are using information and sharing information? I think it's a very difficult ask. And it does strike me that it is, particularly in terms of our editorial guidelines. I remember during the Levinson inquiry, when James Murdoch was asked effectively what checks and balances are placed on Sky journalists. And he rather proudly leaned across the table, picked up a 4-page leaflet and said, "We have guidelines. Here we have them, we have guidelines." If we were to do the same for the BBC, it would need 2 men and a large truck to pick up those guidelines. It's a big, thick book which goes over everything in intrinsic detail. So effectively, I think that the way the BBC has set itself up is to allow us in such a way to be able to offer that authoritative, that trusted, that honest viewpoint, which allows you in turn to make up your mind and not be told what to think. So I think there is a very much a real role for the BBC in that respect. I did actually mention a few minutes ago the idea of passion in broadcasting, and the idea that effectively that you will find there are points of conflict. One other thing that's quite useful to have is a very thick skin. And if you don't have one, don't worry, you'll grow one fairly quickly. I tend to say, people say, are you getting fat? And I say, no, just my skin's getting thicker by the day, basically, which is really the... But in terms of those qualities, that may well be the case, but one quality for me stands out, and I'll tell you a little tale about this in a second, is courage. I think that you have to have not just the courage of your convictions, but sometimes actually real courage. The actual ability to say, this story means so much to me that I'm going to do it. I remember a tale, well, this must be about 6-7 years ago, and it was an event down in St Andrews in the Square, and the panel, as I remember it, was Stuart Cosgrove was on the panel. I think Stuart was actually the chair, if I remember correctly. But on the panel also were Mark Byford, who was the BBC's Deputy Director General at the time, and Charles Allen from ITN. And a chap stood up in the audience and pointed a finger and basically pointed at the panel and said, the stuff you produce is rubbish. And everything went quiet. And he then lambasted everybody on the panel. He went at them with vigour, to which point he was then being applauded by somebody. Your licence fee isn't worth it. You produce rubbish. Nothing you say is truthful. And you can imagine every calumny he could think of was visited upon those who were sitting on the panel. And there was silence. And Stuart turned and said, Mark, would you like to answer that? And Mark started to answer in a very BBC way. He said, well, you know, I understand the passion with which you're bringing that argument, and there could well be some... And he got into his second sentence, and Charles Allen said, excuse me, do you mind if I answer that? I said, oh, of course. And Stuart said, how dare you? How dare you? And the whole place really went silent. And Charles Allen then brought that passion to the argument. He said, I've got journalists working in the Middle East. I've got journalists under fire in Southeast Asia. I've got journalists working in the jungles of South America. I've got journalists infiltrating drug cartels. I've got journalists working beside gangsters and terrorists. How dare you sit there and tell me you're not getting what you think you should get? I'll tell you what we're delivering. And I've never seen anyone shrink. I'm pretty sure he dissolved, actually, because you just saw a person going down and down and down. And I thought, well, there's the other side of the coin. It's very easy to sit and point a finger and criticise, but for somebody who was living and breathing it, with staff literally under such conditions, it did, to me, open up a whole new way of looking at exactly sometimes the criticisms that are visited upon us. I mentioned in all of that the importance of research, the importance of rigour, the importance of getting things absolutely right. And let me use an example. Let me use an Ofcom example, if I might. Ofcom, as Philip says, is the industry regulator. Ofcom, I have always found as one of the most rigorous of those who scrutinise the BBC's content. Part of my role is to scrutinise that content from an internal point of view. If somebody complains, an escalated complaint, which means it's a serious complaint of some sort, I tend not to deal with the editorial side of things. I will deal with complaints that are non-editorial. I dealt with one recently where a gentleman complained that an independent production company had effectively gone onto his land to film without his permission. And effectively at that point I had to get involved because it's not editorial, it's about the actions and it's about the conduct of either BBC staff or those who work for the BBC. So I had to look at that. As it is, I found in the complainant's favour, because having spoken to Highlands and Islands, having spoken to the land planning people, having spoken to various people, including lawyers looking at Land Reform Act 2003, I determined that effectively there had been a transgression. So that's the kind of thing that I do. The other thing I will do is that if it is an editorial complaint, if there's something that somebody says is wrong with our programming and it's serious enough, then either Ofcom will become involved, or before that possibly our own editorial complaints unit in London will become involved. It's an independent body which looks at complaints about the BBC at that escalated level. The BBC Trust could become involved. I won't involve you in the labyrinthine processes of the BBC's complaints mechanism. We could be here for the rest of the afternoon talking about that. So suffice it to say, this was one that went to Ofcom, and it was an interesting one. I don't know if any of you saw the programme. There's been now 2 programmes on it, but the first programme was called The Dog Factory. It was a programme we did about illegal puppy farming. And basically it was about the illegal trafficking of pedigree puppies between Northern Ireland and Scotland. The complaint came in from the gentleman who owned the puppy farm in Northern Ireland. And a puppy farm, for these circumstances, basically, is a very, very, very large building. It's like a large warehouse, which is filled with very, very, very small cages, each of which has a dog or dogs in it, being kept under the most horrendous of conditions. We found out about it, we did the research, and the research had to be meticulous, because effectively, we could be at the other end of a complaint to Ofcom if we'd got it wrong. We were. It was up to us to prove that we hadn't got it wrong. The other part of the research, and this comes back to the courage, is that to get the evidence for that, we had to undertake secret filming. And Sam Poling and the crew, basically Sam and Liam, she and Liam had to go to Northern Ireland and film under cover of darkness. In fact, in dead of night, using infrared cameras to actually get into the premises. Now, there are some very, very, very high hurdles that we have to get across to be able to do that kind of thing. We have to prove that there is a public value in that. We have to prove that there is no other way of gaining that kind of material, and we have to prove that the material we gained provides evidence for the case that that's being put. Now, the gentleman in question was pretty unhappy because we had done that. The danger to Sam was not just the fact that had that happened and had they been discovered, then they were potentially in personal danger. We knew that because the gentleman in question, let's say, has some rather unsavoury friends in Northern Ireland. I won't say any more than that, but just enough to think that you potentially are quite in some danger here. We got the footage, it went into the programme. They spent many, many, many hours in putting that together. When the complaint came in, we had to go back over absolutely everything. We had to go back over the footage. We had to go back over the transcript of it. We had to go back over the production notes. We had to look at all of the rushes, everything that had fallen on the cutting room floor. Because not only had we to prove what the programme actually said, we had to be able to prove to Ofcom, and I think this is where the rigour of Ofcom comes in, we had to be able to show that what had been discarded did not in any way overturn the argument that was being put in the finished programme. Now, it was a long and it was a painstaking process. It involved complete scrutiny of all of that material. It involved long, long, long discussions with the programme team as we constructed the argument. But as we constructed the argument, I actually felt quite privileged because it gave me an insight into the minute detail that had been observed in actually producing this as a programme. And I think at that point, I'm glad to say at the very end of it, Ofcom agreed that effectively, and they don't always agree, there was a judgment this morning which went against us. That sometimes happens, the nature of the beast. But on this occasion, they looked at it and thought, yep, the scrutiny that is there is absolutely rigorous. The argument holds. There was more public value in doing what you did to get that particular footage, to put that programme together, than there was in not doing it. And I think this gets to the value, and I guess to that question as well about where does this go? Is it just 28 minutes, 47 seconds of TV that's forgotten this time next week? In that particular case, it wasn't, because effectively it led to calls in the Northern Ireland Assembly for changes in the relevant legislation. It led to, I'm trying to think what else it led to. I'm trying to think. It led to, oh yes, Her Majesty's Customs and Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. They became particularly interested in it and in the individuals involved, because we are talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds involved in the illegal trade in puppies. And all of that money was exchanging hands in car parks. And you can be pretty sure that very little of it, if any, was being, certainly HMRC were certainly not being advised that that money was actually being used in such transactions. So they've already got a number of cases out against a number of the individuals involved. And the third thing is, on the back of the Panorama programme a couple of weeks back, which this was the second part of that, if you like, Cairn Ryan, the ferry company, have now imposed stringent restrictions on the transport of dogs between Northern Ireland, between Ireland and Scotland. They're trying to stop it as well. So the public good is manifest in a whole range of ways there. And I'm delighted to say that for the two programme makers, for Sam and for Liam, they were effectively they won the Royal Television Society Award a month or so back for the best current affairs programme. So recognition from their peers in the process as well. All of that was underpinned by the most meticulous research. And rather like, I guess, lettering through rock, you'll find me sort of repeating that mantra time and time again, effectively. It's that which makes memorable programmes. And effectively, if you don't make memorable programmes, people are not going to watch. The ones that live longest in our memories are those which are innovative and new, such as Monty Python or Blue Planet, Walking with Dinosaurs, Bake Off, Sherlock, whatever it happens to be. We all have a different choice, I think, there. But these are the ones that come most readily to mind. Or it could be innovative dramas like Wolf Hall, or reality formats such as The Apprentice or Dragon's Den. It could be children's programmes. One of the most important ones we've made recently is one that's just sitting under the radar called Life Babble, which effectively is for young children of the ages of about 5 and 6 who are having to deal with quite serious issues in their home lives. What happens if a parent dies? What happens if there's drug abuse in the family? What happens, and so on and so forth. So effectively you think, this isn't the stuff of children's programmes, but if it isn't, then what should be? Balamory is great, but it can't all be Balamory. Nina and the Neurons is wonderful for teaching science, but there's more to it as well. There are moral issues, there are ethical issues, and because you're 6 years of age, it doesn't mean to say they don't impact on you. So again, that's the kind of programming that I think the BBC should and must be making. And all the way through, if you like, to recently, if you think that Panorama is there, Springwatch is there, the impact in our lives, Watchdog impacts on our lives. The recent Radio Scotland season on dementia is a really important one. So I guess my message there is that broadcasting matters. Whether right now you're waiting to see what happens in the EU referendum at the end of this week, or you're interested in the presidential race in the US, or what's happening, what's the situation in Syria, or you're watching the European football finals at the moment, or you're coming to terms, as most of us are, with what happened last week in the tragic death of MP Joe Cox. Effectively, a lot of what we understand about the world is brought to us through the medium of broadcasting, through television and radio. It's an important conduit, a really important conduit, and one that we must trust in. I mentioned Charter at the beginning there, and I'll talk a little bit about that. This is the 9th Charter in the BBC's 90-year history as a corporation. And in some ways, I think it's the most important, because others have moved bits of the machinery around, bits of the furniture have moved around, have changed shape here and there. This one has involved a fundamental root and branch review of the BBC's very existence. What is the BBC? Why should it be there? What's its role? What's its scale? What's its scope? How should it be governed? How should it be paid for? How should you fund it? And going forward, how does it sit relative to everything else that's out there? As Philip was suggesting, we live in a radically different world from that which we lived in a number of years ago. Broadcasting is a very, very, very broad landscape, and there are a lot of different organisations working within that landscape. Just to give an idea of how important it was, I think that's reflected in the fact that the DCMS, Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and the BBC Trust, separately but together, taking this accumulatively, they ran 2 questionnaires asking people of what they thought about the BBC. On the back of the review of the Charter, what did they think about it? The best part of 250,000 responses came back. And the best part of those responses all seemed to indicate one thing. People were in favour of the BBC. They could see its value. It's interesting, the one thing you hear often, in fact, I haven't heard anybody who hasn't said this, who's lived abroad, is that you only really start to value the BBC once you've been abroad, and then you come back and think, what have I been missing? I worked for 3 years in the Middle East and I watched Showtime. Now, 3 years of Showtime is pretty daunting. Basically, there's only so many episodes of Jag you can watch before eventually it drives you completely crazy. Although my favourite, I have to say, was the European Championship football, which they didn't actually take the beginning, they just took the whole package. So the programme was known as Insert Titles Here. What they're supposed to do, you can guess what they're supposed to do, but we used to look forward to Insert Titles Here once a week. It was fabulous. What a great programme. But effectively, that's what the BBC basically, the audience was saying to us basically, we like what you do. And we quite like what you're suggesting going forward, the changes you're thinking of introducing. However, do not introduce change if there's a danger of sacrifice of what we already have. People don't like things being taken off them. You saw that a few years ago when the BBC decided to try and take 6 Music off air. 6 Music is now one of the most popular services that the BBC has on radio. Largely because people said, oh, it's going to be taken off us. What is it? I'm going to go and listen to it. That's pretty good. I don't want to lose that. And all of a sudden it grew its audience. So maybe if you hear us tomorrow, we're taking Radio 4 off air, you know what we're up to, you know. But, so anyway, the relevance of all of this, if I can bring that together, I think the one good thing about the white paper is it didn't produce the horror stories that we thought it might, the predicted horror stories that some were suggesting, that the BBC would be reined in, that its scale and scope would be diminished, that effectively its television schedules would be wrapped up, and that effectively you would find that the big shiny floor shows on BBC One on a Saturday night would be replaced by 1970s Open University programmes with earnest young men in long brown coats and beards talking at us endlessly for an afternoon, for an evening. That didn't come to pass, I'm glad to say, and that's not what the white paper does say. I think there's 3 things, though, just as I start to wrap up, there's 3 things it does say, and I think they're quite important. It talks about distinctiveness, it talks about diversity, and it talks about partnership. And I think they're really important. And I think as I started to look at it, it does rather helpfully give us a definition of what it thinks is distinctiveness. And that reads as a requirement that the BBC should be substantially different to other providers across each and every service, both in prime time and overall, and on television, radio and online. Now that might sound like common sense, of course, give us something different. Don't do the same as everybody else, because why would we pay for a public service broadcaster if you're doing exactly the same thing that everybody else is doing? But there could be a catch there, and I think this is something we've got to be wary about. Because my question is, what do you mean by substantially different? How is a BBC One drama substantially different from one that's delivered on ITV or Sky? How is the BBC's news offer substantially different from that which is delivered through ITN? Is Bake Off substantially different? Is it distinctive? Is Strictly Come Dancing distinctive? What about Radio 1? We have to be really careful that what is in that paper is not suggesting that the BBC should become a market failure broadcast model, only choosing to show content that nobody else will. I think that's a really important point to make. Reith's original maxim of the BBC should inform, educate and entertain was deliberately structured in that way. That there is that's not just a random list, it is in that order of importance. However, it's interesting that 2 years ago the BBC Trust asked that very question of audiences, and the first thing they said, what should the BBC be doing? And the first thing they said was entertaining. So I think the idea that basically entertainment should go down the list for things that are more worthy or more distinctive. I think we have to be quite careful that that terminology is not a catch-all for something else. It's not a replacement of something else. I think we've got to be very careful in that. The second thing it mentioned there was diversity. And I think that's a fair ask on the BBC. It's looking for more diversity on air. It wants to see more of local people. It wants to see more of people from around the UK. It wants to see the nations and regions of the BBC represented on the BBC. And I think that's fair. It wants to see representation of a whole range of audiences, of audience groups on the BBC. It's only fair. The licence fee is a compulsory funding model. In that case, those who pay it have a right to see themselves reflected on it. It strikes me as I was scribbling this down, I was remembering that in 2003, we undertook a major survey into our television news outlook, our offer on TV news. If you like, it's what followed the calls for the Scottish Six, as it was called at that time. And we interviewed, I think it was about 1,084 people. So we'd qualitative research, we'd quantitative research, we did focus groups, and the Broadcasting Council, which is the forerunner to the current Audience Council for Scotland, wandered the length and breadth of the country. And interestingly, this was crystallised in a comment made in a meeting in Dundee, in what Professor Hugh Pennington, who was then a member of the Broadcasting Council, referred to as the Dundee question. And those in Dundee very clearly said to us, we want to see ourselves on air. We want to see our lives being reflected to the whole of the UK. We want to see Dundee being reflected to the whole of the UK. We want people to know about the bioscience work that's happening here. We want to know about the digital work that's happening here, what's happening in the arts in Dundee. And at the same time, we want the rest of the UK reflected back to us. And in essence, that message very clearly is within the BBC's current public purposes, and it will increasingly become an important part of the debate and discussion going forward, because it's not just a general catch-all, it's the UK in all its diversity being reflected back on screen and on air. And likewise, I think it's really important for the BBC to show diversity in its workforce. And that has not been terribly easy. Particular groups it's not their first port of call. The BBC has always been one of the most important first jobs for a lot of graduates. It's an attractive option for graduates. But there are groups who are not represented well within our workforce. Black and ethnic minority groups are not represented well within our workforce, either at a senior level or at a ground level within the workforce itself. Likewise with disabled groups or disabled individuals are not well represented. The working classes, C2DE, are not well represented. It's a favourite stamping ground for graduates, absolutely, but we have to look much broader. We have to become a much more less inclusive organisation, and one that's much more expansive. And that's what gets me to my last point, which is about partnership. And exactly as Dee says, it's incumbent on us. It used to be said that the BBC partnership was something the BBC did to you. You know, you would come along and say, hi, we're your new partner, here's what we're going to do to you. And you just took it, basically. We were the big gorilla in the jungle. The BBC isn't the big gorilla in the jungle any longer. We are the biggest broadcaster in the UK, but when you compare us to others who have entered the broadcasting field, Amazon, Google, Netflix, Sky even, basically. It does strike me, one example I very often use is that in 2004, our budget per annum was around 5 billion. Apple had a similar budget, about 4 billion rather. Apple had the same. In 2014, our budget had risen to 5 billion, and Apple's had gone to 69 billion. And Apple, like BT, like Virgin, like a lot of these organisations, is moving at speed into the broadcast market. So the BBC as a big gorilla in that market is not necessarily any longer the case. But it's absolutely incumbent that us, as that public service broadcaster, as that public purse funded entity, that we should try and, if you like, how should I put this? Draw on the weight and the strength of our resources and combine them with others to produce more than the sum of our parts. I think that's an important message for the BBC going forward. In all of that then, let me just try and draw, I'm aware that time is moving on apace, so I'll draw this together as I can. As I say, some things are changing. This charter will change the structure of the BBC quite dramatically. I haven't mentioned anything about the BBC's governance arrangements. So we want to speak about that a bit later. I'm more than happy to do that. I haven't spoken about licence fee. We could be here at 8 o'clock at night, so, and I know that probably you don't want to be here at 8 o'clock at night. There's a bar open in 45 minutes, so I want to make sure that we've got time just to finish off with some questions. Things are changing, but there are some things that haven't changed. And I think sometimes we have to stand back and just remember what hasn't changed. And I think basically what hasn't changed is that public appetite for information and entertainment. What hasn't changed is the importance of finding new ways to tell stories that matter, and of providing content that's underpinned by the most meticulous research. Finding stories, effectively, that audiences can trust in. And that research can take all sorts of forms. It could be the psychological profiling of contestants on game shows. Philip raised the question about how do we know that everybody who takes part in a reality show is fully aware of what the consequences of that action can bring. Or that research can be the other side of the coin. It could be the heavy research that underpins our specialist factual programmes. One programme that comes back to me time and time again is a programme we did a number of years ago. And to give an idea of how well it can work, it was basically, I found myself on a Saturday night. I was hoovering, God help me. On a Saturday night I was hoovering. And I stopped hoovering because I found an excuse to stop hoovering, but it wasn't a hard excuse to find. It was a BBC Two programme going out at 7:30 on a Saturday night called Parallel Lives, Parallel Worlds. And basically what it was narrated by the lead guitar player with Eels, Mark Everett. Mark Everett's father was, quite literally, the father of quantum mechanics. But he never knew his father because his father constantly was a man in a white coat in a laboratory. He never ever got to know his father. What this programme did was it was a journey for Mark Everett to try and understand who his father was, and at the same time it was a journey to explain quantum mechanics. And it did it brilliantly by parallel worlds, parallel lives, so you had multiple options, different universes, all travelling beside each other. You think on paper, Mark Everett finds who his dad is and we explain quantum mechanics on a Saturday night. Whoa, I'm going to stay in for that one. That sounds like a lot of fun. But the very way it was delivered, the innovative way, the imaginative way it was delivered, made it a programme that lives on in the memory, simply because of the way it was put together. And very often that's what it is. Innovation and imagination is not necessarily about telling new stories. Sometimes it's telling old stories in new ways. Bake Off is simply a baking competition. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire is a general knowledge quiz. Strictly Come Dancing first saw light of day 50 odd years ago on Come Dancing. Doctor Who's been around forever. So these are not new ideas, but they're reimagined. The other side of the coin, I keep talking about two sides of a coin, but the other side of the coin is that yes, there are new stories to tell. As the world changes, there are new stories to tell. Research will underpin every part of that. You have a part to play in all of that. So I'd like applications on the desk before I go. I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much. Thank you.